and welcome to this special edition of The Right Stuff. I'm the Queen, Parker J. Thanks for joining me. Today, we are going to be talking to another author from this wonderful anthology called A Time for Everything. I've been telling you guys all about it, and this is an anthology inspired by Ecclesiastes 3. If you don't know what Ecclesiastes 3 is, it's basically a time for everything poem. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to win, a time to lose, a time to gather stones, a time to scatter stones, and all those different times that encapsulate the human condition and human experience. Today, I have another author with me from that anthology. Her name is Sammy Beuker, and she wrote in the collection, A Time to Be Silent. Sammy, how you doing today?
I'm so good. Thanks for having me here, Parker. I can't wait to talk to you about this.
And I'm so glad you took time out of your schedule to be here with me today. I don't take it lightly. And so before we start recording, we were getting to know each other. And Sammy is a youth director as well as a published author who writes for the general market. And she started to foray into the faith-based market. So I'm really glad you're here because this story is really overtly in your face, definitely a Christian message. And it's about when to be silent and when to speak up. And I think for our current culture, being silent is something we do a lot of. And sometimes it can be a good thing and sometimes it can be a bad thing. So what was the impetus behind this particular story that made you want to explore it in this fashion?
That's such a great question. So this story sort of poured out of me. As you said, I am a youth director. I work for a church, and we have mixed race staff, and we have conversations about how to best work for our constituency, both those in our four walls and in our neighborhood. And we were having a conversation, a particularly difficult conversation one time. And my dear friend, a pastor, looked at me and he said, "Well, Sammy, if you're not going to speak up, like, why do I have to talk about all the hard things all the time? Why do you get to stay silent?" And I was really impacted by that based on the conversation that we were having. And I started going, oh, how often am I silent in the face of things that I should not be silent about? And so when Ben Avery approached me to write the story, this is what poured out. It's also inspired by one of Jesus's stories found in John chapter 8. And then the verse or the theme throughout scripture that if we as God's chosen people do not speak up, then the rocks and the trees will cry out. They will give him praise. They will weep and mourn. And so it became for me a story about our responsibility to speak up when we see injustice. In my story, I make it overtly racial. It's a white woman who needs to learn to speak up when she sees stuff that's not okay. It begins with her not wanting to do that. And then throughout the story, we see how her heart has changed a little bit.
When we talk about racial injustice, particularly in the U.S., it's such a really complex issue. And I think you did a good job in focusing this very complex issue on the individual, because maybe you can't change the whole world around you, but you could do one thing in your own sphere of influence. And so you get the impression that we use the pejorative Karen in the story, this quintessential Karen. She even has a labradoodle, right? She even has, and it's funny. I hate to do stereotypes. I truly do. But in some of these incidences, some of these women do really exhibit certain qualities. But again, it's a stereotype. I don't want to propagate stereotypes, of course. But in this, she's definitely a Karen. So when you start to read the book, you go, this is a Karen. And for those who say Karen is pejorative, please understand we're just using that as just an example of the kind of mindset. We're not talking about people whose names are Karen, right?
Yeah.
You know.
Well,
but
and to that end, I have a number of very good friends who are named Karen, who would never behave in this way. And I also use the pejorative. I use that stereotype because we all understand that stereotype. When we say, "Oh, she's a Karen," we know collectively what we're talking about. And when you jump into something like a science fiction or a fantasy story and you are quickly trying to orient yourself in a new space, it helps to use even stereotypes to orient a reader into exactly where you need them to be.
And this is urban sci-fi, by the way. in all honesty, she's not a bad person. I did not get the impression she's a bad person. She actually does care about her community.
Mm-hmm.
So she's walking and she goes to sit down at a park and she sees this weird looking tree. And this weird looking tree. The tree is an oak tree, because she's usually used to seeing this pine tree. But she looks at this weird oak tree and it's shaped almost like someone's trying to embrace the sky. And what happens after that?
So then she is pulled into the heart of the tree, and then out of the heart of the tree into a familiar but unfamiliar place. It's still a city, it's still a neighborhood, but it's not the neighborhood she was in. It's rougher and quieter and dirtier than the place that she's used to. And she comes upon a scene that's really troubling to her. Mm-hmm. And she is first of all, it's a very uncomfortable scene for her. She's never experienced anything like that before. But then also, she finds out she's powerless in this scene. Her voice is gone. She is unable to speak into this scene. And around her, nature is responding to the injustice that's playing out. And around her, the trees are crying out or shaking and vibrating at the injustice that's being perpetrated. And it's an injustice. It's also just an unfairness. It's a really hard and painful kind of situation, something I've seen in my own world. And she is shook. And she goes over to these trees that are responding to this situation that she sees, and she is pulled back into her own time. And she doesn't know what to do with this. What do you do with this what have I seen? Is this true? Can this be real? It is so outside of her experience that she then starts asking questions. And could I have done something? And is this fair? And is this right? And it sort of starts to lead her on this journey of discovery to know what is fair and what is legal and what is right and what is good. And I think that becomes the tension point for her as the story progresses.
I like the aspect of the trees responding to injustice, because we're so used to nature being seen as not necessarily observant, but just part of the scenery. But the Lord, there's several times where the Lord says the rocks will cry out, you know. And I was thinking, just from a scientific perspective, there's so much information that rocks tell us. There's a scene in there, and we won't go too deep into it because we want you to pick up your copy of A Time for Everything, which is a speculative fiction anthology inspired by Ecclesiastes 3, edited by Ben Navy from Onward and Upward Media. And when they pick up the rocks start to wail. And I won't tell you what it is. The rocks start to wail, and she just feels their song just wailing around her. So that's why it was interesting when I was reading the story too. It's like, what if this is the Lord uses Sammy to show this connection between nature and man? Now, Sammy, you do have some other works on the table there. Let's talk about some of the things you've already written.
All right. So, I most recently, I even have a copy of it, just published, The Unfortunate Life of Genevieve Ryder. This is it's a historical fiction, women's book club kind of book. It follows the life of a woman named Jen Ryder, who finds out that she is pregnant outside of being married just after World War II. And she's sent away to a home, and she chooses to keep her child, which goes against the grain of society. And then what happens to her as she progresses through life, and as life is very real for her, and there are choices and there are consequences, and it follows her through her life as those consequences unspool themselves for her. And then I write on my blog. I have a website, and I write on there about books. I love to talk about books and how books inspire us, and how we can learn from books, how we can connect to other people and other experiences through different kinds of books. And so I write on there weekly, and I'm hoping to do more. I just want to do more. I love stories, and I love telling stories, and I love connecting people through stories. And I love being able to have a difficult conversation because we have the united language of a story. Right. And so being able to write an urban fantasy sci-fi story that will hopefully connect with somebody and encourage them in their own sphere, or cause them to ask questions, so many of the stories I've already read in Time for Everything have just made me think about something a little bit differently, which I really appreciate. And I just think that story has so much power to influence the way that we think and can see the world. So I love to write stories and tell people and talk about them with other people.
Sammy, I want to thank you so much for being with me today. Really just talk about the book, talk about your works. Hope to have you back on the show real soon.
That'd be great. Thanks so much, Parker. Have a wonderful day.
And thank you, dear listener, for joining us for this special edition of The Right Stuff. I'm the Queen, Parker J. You have a wonderful, absolutely glorious, blessed day.